What are you doing out here? How did you get outside? Oh, I know, you wanted to be outside because we're talking about public art today. Well, let's get back into the studio and start to talk about it. Last time we used video art as a way of talking about intimate narratives, some that can make references even to grander narratives. We also saw how in the 1980s and onward that video art was very experimental, that artists didn't have everything worked out neatly ahead of time, they often learned as they went. That's the basis of experimentation. Artists approach experimentation differently. Some want to be calculated about it, more scientific, keeping notes and charting their way. Others just want to get right in there and start creating with the attitude that they'll figure it out as the next problem comes along. Now, thinking about experimental art and art that is public, let's look more closely at how these combine in narratives of the Canadian situation. First, let's remind ourselves that public art is generally conservative. It's often celebratory or commemorative. A war memorial is a typical example of conservative public art. It's usually a form of sculpture and it's expensive. There's also another form of public art that is much more experimental. We usually find these in public biennales. A biennale is a temporary exhibition of art where participants come from other places, countries, other regions, other cities, and the artists apply to have their work accepted. Often the biennale is funded with public money, usually a combination of corporate donations and government grants. The artwork is not typically for sale. Artists want to be accepted to biennales because it is an extremely good thing for their CVs. Public art has the possibility, because the work is often experimental, of offending some people. Let's look at Public Art Biennale that was held in Richmond and Vancouver to coincide with the 2010 Olympics. One of the public sculptures was Miss Mao balancing on the head of Lenin. It was a controversial sculpture, and the city officials behind the exhibition received hundreds of complaints about the sculpture. People who complained, usually on behalf of someone else actually, said that they thought that the sculpture was offensive. The subject, in this case, was a representation of Chairman Mao depicted as a young girl balancing on the top of the Russian philosopher and political figure Lenin. Some people complained, mistakenly, confusing Lenin for Stalin, saying that they did not like to have a Soviet responsible for numerous deaths in wartime depicted in Richmond. Lenin, of course, was the father of communism. The city officials did not back away and kept the sculpture in place because they believed that dialogue is important even when people disagree. It was an interesting lesson, and it allowed people to engage with ideas through public sculpture. Other public sculpture that was part of a biennale in Vancouver did not fare quite so well. David Oppenheim's device to root out evil was installed in a small public area near some condos on the Vancouver waterfront. It was also part of a biennale. It depicted a church balanced on its steeple. You either loved it or you hated it. A few local residents wrote letters to the city to have it removed, and it was eventually sent to Calgary. The trouble was it was a site-specific sculpture, so the artist was extremely upset by the removal of the piece. I'd like you to spend some time thinking about whose narrative was being told when it comes to each of these public sculptures. Who does the responsibility fall to protect public art? Under what circumstances should public art be removed? Then come to class prepared to help your group to write a call for artists to participate in a National Biennale of Public Art. In class, you'll write a short call designated to attract artists who have a national narrative to tell through art. Some things to consider are: what form should it take? That is it celebratory, memorial, or religious? What materials would you expect to be used? What's the budget? Mostly, How do you want to explain about the national narrative? See you in class.